G'day and welcome to the Transport Leaders Podcast. I'm Graham McCabe. I'm a transport planner and traffic engineer with close to 30 years experience working across the Asia Pacific. And with me today is my co-host, as always, Russell King. G'day, Russell.
G'day, Graham. Hello, everyone. I'm a transport strategist and founder of the Transport Leader blog and newsletter. I've worked on the policy side of transport for around 20 years.
Okay, Russell, what are we going to talk about today?
Today, Graham, we're going to talk about something that is a problem, I think, in the way that we govern our transport systems, and that's when we put transport generalists in charge of transport systems rather than transport experts.
So are we talking about people in the bureaucracy, or are we talking about at political level and decision makers here?
Yeah,
Which one are we focusing on?
we're talking very much in the bureaucracy. So we tend to take people who have very little understanding of transport and put them in charge of transport agencies. And that's something that's happening not just in Australia, but you see it around the world. Yeah, I think that would be a good topic to discuss as to the pros and cons of having somebody who's not a transport expert running our transport systems.
Okay, so I can't be one of those people.
Oh, I don't know. Are you an expert? I hadn't picked up on it in these conversations. But if you think of yourself as a transport expert, I'll let you get away with that one.
Well, I'm a sarcastic dummy spitter, I think, is the terminology from one of the commenters online.
Well,
let's stick with that.
You've got a bunch of formal qualifications for doing transport as well, don't you? I don't know how many letters you have after your name that are transport and engineering related. I suspect it's quite a few. I have none of those.
It's a number. Yeah. Okay. All right.
So, I can claim
okay.
to be an amateur, I think, whereas I think your claim doesn't stand up to your qualification scrutiny.
Yeah. Okay. So, not that it would have ever happened to me, given my inability to shut my mouth. Old school people would, start out as a cadet and slowly rise through the management ranks, getting filtered through the funnel until one in a generation would become the head of the bureaucracy, and that's what we saw up until the mid 2000s, and then since then it's been more politically oriented. Or do you think it started before the 2000s?
Well, I think there's a kind of couple of aspects in here. So the Westminster style of government with independent public services, normally with professional public servants at the top who are really selected by the public service historically rather than politicians. One of the features of that model has often been a belief in generalists, and the underlying philosophy being that what you need is smart people at the top of the organization with good sort of generic leadership skills, and that subject matter knowledge is less important because generalists know how to ask good questions. And therefore, if they ask good questions, they can get good information from the technical experts. And therefore, they do not need to be technical experts themselves. They just need to be good leaders of organizations. That's, I think, the rationale for a lot of the historic putting generalists in place across agencies. You see this across the public service.
But there are always generalists from within the agents. So you might not have somebody who managed operations, but you had somebody who was around people who managed operations and picked up things through osmosis so that they could ask intelligent questions.
I think this is different I think this is one of the characteristics that's different between, say, the UK and Australia. I think the UK in the senior levels of the public service is much more focused on generalists than the public services generally in Australia, and certainly when it comes to transport. So I'd agree, from an Australian context, I think you're right. I think that historically, the vast majority of people that have run the transport agencies in charge of transport in Australia have had a transport background of one sort or another.
Yeah. And
I'll talk about one of the challenges we have, not with them historically, but also moving forward as well. But yes.
Yeah. And then you get very different systems where they're very technocratic, where, the best technical person rises to the top, and ones that are very political, where it's all about which alignment you have politically.
Yeah. So obviously the American system has sort of professional public service, but with political appointees at the top of the organizations. Not politicians, but political appointees, whether that's the Department of Transport federally or state-level departments of transport or city-level departments of transport as well.
Yeah.
And it's a real mixed bag for them as to whether they end up with political appointees who are appointed effectively because of their political understanding, or whether they're appointed because of their technical expertise and obviously political alignment as well, because they are political appointees. But sometimes they have technical experience in transport and sometimes they do not. I think it was marked when the most recent appointment of the head of the New York City Department of Transport, I think it's Mike Flynn, he has a long background in transport. I think it was telling that people said it was refreshing that they had somebody who understood transport as the transport commissioner for the department. So I think that gives you kind of flavor of it. The other thing I think you see a lot in the US as well is they often have like boards that are politically appointed as well in charge. And a lot of those people don't have any transport experience either. They can often be, a variety of backgrounds for political reasons, not necessarily having transport expertise on that board.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you can have deep political influence and interference at the legislative level as well, in the US. Okay. All right. Well, you and I know the Westminster system in Australia, UK, New Zealand, Canada much better. So let's focus on that one. Okay. So post mid-2000s in Australia, we start getting people with zero transport experience, and often zero government or limited government experience getting appointed to senior roles. And so you've worked in ministerial office, possibly having influence in appointments.
Yes, I think that's fair.
Yes.
We
Okay.
we appointed, when I was in the office, we appointed a new head of the department because there was a vacancy, and inevitably I was asked for my advice on it.
And how far down does that political influence go these days? Does it stay at the head? Does it go down into the deputy secretary level, executive director level? So for any budding senior managers who want to get on in the world, at which point should they start looking into the political realm for, assisting a career move?
So I think one of the problems we have in the Australian public service is the increasing politicization of the service.
Mm.
And I think that it has been, for some time, there are people with strong links to one political party or another put into the top 3 tiers of transport organizations, whether that's the head of the department, a deputy, or someone just the next level down. And that causes a problem because when the government changes, someone with stronger political affiliations to the opposition, inevitably there is a deficit of trust.
And if your appointments come through we like this person because they have a similar political alignment, regardless of their technical competency or their managerial competency, there's that level of distrust that you're talking about. So how do the senior bureaucrats overcome that?
So I think if they are a political appointee or a politically connected person, it is extremely challenging. But I have seen people get over that. And the way that they do that is by being very competent and highly professional. And then they gather the respect. Certainly when I was in government, I knew a few people who were, Labour affiliated, opposition affiliated, okay? And they were a mixed bag. Some of them were excellent, right? And I would more than happily work with again. And others were quite frankly, you were bemused at how they ever got their position. And you suspected that it was the political affiliation was the most important thing, not their technical competency.
So we have these people in charge, regardless of which part of the horseshoe donut that is modern politics that they come from, and they're making decisions. So how do we get them making good decisions? Because that's one of the themes that we always talk about is how can we do things better? How do we get these people informed?
Okay, so let's talk about the problem with having people who are not transport people and understand transport first of all. So a lot of the philosophy of the public service and civil service will be, well, these people are smart people, they'll ask good questions. And I think, one of the things we've talked about a lot on our podcast is a lot of the right solutions in transport are counterintuitive. And so getting to ask the right questions is hard because the answers are counterintuitive. So if the answer is, oh, look, this road is congested, their default position is, as it
Build
is with
more
the vast
roads.
majority of property, is build more roads, add an extra lane. Similarly, you see this with regards to things like, parking in town centres. There's a lack of parking and, the town centre is struggling for parking. The answer is, let's build more parking, as opposed to things like, actually, parking's free and that's a problem. You're not regulating the parking. You're not providing alternatives for accessibility to the town centre, such as walking, cycling, public transport, etc. So there's a whole bunch of stuff here where the intuitive answer for non-experts is the wrong answer. And therefore, those questions are very hard to ask just because you're a smart person. You don't understand the transport system and how it operates. Let's be honest about it. There's large numbers of people who are transport experts who struggle with these concepts.
Yeah. So again, going back to your experience on the political side of things, if you have people who don't understand the system they've been put in charge of, then trying to provide advice to ministers or engage with the media, that seems like it can come back and bite the elected officials in the bum, because you end up with what might be seen as popular decisions, but actually end up being not popular or not effective.
So there's a couple of things in here, right? So in the short term, you get away with it, okay? So a road is congested, all right? They're going to build an extra lane, right? Everybody's happy. This will solve the congestion problem, okay? It'll take a couple of years to build the extra lane at least, okay? And then it'll be a few years before the congestion returns, just worse, okay? So by then, the minister has moved on. Quite often, the government has moved on, right? And so there's no accountability in that sense. The public servant will have moved on as well. And so the mistake, although it's been made, it's never, people aren't held accountable for it because it's not recognized as a mistake. So in that sense, the incentives are not great for getting better decisions. The other problem is, as you say, is if you don't understand the transport system and you're advising the minister, it's effectively the blind leading the blind, because ministers don't understand the transport system. That's not their job, right? They're supposed to be somebody who, is a member of the public, in effect, that has been elected to act on their behalf. They're not expected to be an expert in the particular field that they have been appointed to. Now, over time, they will accumulate knowledge and understanding of that. But in the case of transport, there are people with 20 years of experience who are still very much learning every day about the transport system, and I'd include myself in that, right? So, we can't expect politicians to understand these things by giving them advice from somebody who also doesn't understand it. That's just asking for failure.
Okay. So we've diagnosed the problem. You've been accumulating all this knowledge. So, as people, I want to say, what's the one quick fix?
Okay, so we probably haven't diagnosed the secondary problem that comes across on this as well, which is an important point as well, right? Because one of the answers to fixing this is think about your leadership in an organization like transport as a team, right? So maybe you have a generalist at the top of the organization, but then you compensate for that with deep expertise across your team. People who've got expertise in operations and strategy and planning, people who understand assets, people who understand projects and building stuff on time and on budget and those sorts of things, right? So you want to get all of those competencies to compensate for the fact that the person at the top hasn't got a clue what they're, in terms of technical knowledge. The problem is that if you're a generalist, guess what you believe in is the right way forward for leadership? It's have more generalists. So you see this recently in the UK's Department of Transport. So they appointed a generalist at the top of the Department of Transport. And then they had some senior appointments, vacancies coming up, which I had seen on LinkedIn. And I thought, it'd be interesting to see who they appoint in these positions. And of course, who they appointed was civil servants from other departments with no experience in transport. So you now have 3 people in that leadership team, all relatively new to the department, but also new to transport. And yes, they might be great leaders, etc. But what you've got here is a dearth of understanding of the transport system within the leadership. How good can you expect the outcomes to be? Bearing in mind the Department of Transport in the UK has been struggling even when it's had experts.
So, and going back to, talking about the actual Westminster system rather than, I suppose, lowercase Westminster system. So how has this come about? Is this that the UK is going down the same pathway of secretaries of state being involved in appointments?
I think there's a little bit of that. So that is there is something of that. I don't think it's as political as it is in Australia. In fact, I'm pretty certain it's not as political as it is in Australia. But there is a kind of, is this person going to fit the minister? So there is definitely an aspect of that, but it's much less, does this person have a political affiliation? So in the civil service in the UK, I would say it's much less political. Like, people with strong political links to a political party are much rarer in the senior ranks of the civil service in the UK than they are in Australia. But there are people who are, recognised as more likely aligned with the values of a particular minister. Right. And so there's a kind of combination of, there's a lot of civil service influence on the decision still, but it's ultimately, the Prime Minister of the day is appointing the secretaries. And although it's not a direct political heavy appointment, they're looking for someone that the minister's going to get on with, which is an understandable aspect of it. But again, one of the things I think is the civil service is still recommending generalists into transport.
And okay, so you've got, as we talked about, you've got this issue with generalists. Now, in our pre-discussion, you've mentioned Transport for London as an example. Is that a good example or a bad?
Okay, so in terms of outcomes, London is doing pretty well on the transport side of things and has been for quite a while. It's been on a journey, but I think most people would say that London has been on the right direction for 25 or so years across a range of mayors from different colours. So, the governance model is proven over, a quarter of a century, and across multiple political parties. Now, what they've got there is they have an directly elected mayor who's in charge of transport, and the mayor appoints two people. They appoint a deputy mayor for transport, which is a political appointment. So it tends to be somebody from their political affiliation, but typically it's somebody who is interested in the area that they're being appointed to. So it's not just, you're a good bloke, you'll help me out, I'll put you in this. They tend to be a person who is political, but, so affiliated with whichever colour of party is got the mayoral office, but also actually understands the area. Okay. But more importantly, they then have another appointment, which is the commissioner, the transport commissioner. This is the person who heads up Transport for London, and they're a technical expert. And their job is to work with the deputy mayor and the mayor to deliver a transport system. So what you've got there is a combination of the political side of things, but with a spin on understanding transport and deep transport expertise. So what you've got at the senior levels of sort of decision making, other than the mayor, is quite a lot of understanding around transport. And that's, I think, gets much better decisions. Doesn't mean that, London is perfect in terms of its transport decisions by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it's getting a lot more right than it's getting wrong. And as I say, that's been through a whole series of mayors and different colours. So it's a model that's working very well.
Again, we've got a system that's working relatively well, and we've got systems that aren't working so well. They're probably going to, rule ourselves out of any senior appointment in any form of government through this conversation. But hey,
I've already done that, I think. But in fact, I pretty much criticised every government in the world. Actually, I think no one would want to touch me now with a barge pole. Be like, but Russell wrote a blog about how awful your policy is. Yes, he did. So I'm dead to that world now, I think.
Okay, all right. So how do let's talk about how. Sorry, before we move on. Okay, is this an issue of, when people surround themselves by people who think alike? Obviously, you get groupthink, but also there's a tendency to get, for a minister, secretary of state, whatever, says, not happy with the way the agency's performing. You head of the department, do a review. And so a review's done, and the reviews very rarely find that there's a lack of technical expertise at senior levels, do they? They often come out with, you need more people like you. Well, not you personally, but you as the departmental secretary.
I think we'd start talking about the flaws of the reviews generally, right? Typically the people that are appointed to reviews are appointed by people who the secretary is happy with and the minister is happy with, and the people doing the reviews, it's not in their interest to upset either party. So it kind of like they're basically going to get the answer that the minister and the secretary are looking for anyway. So the reviews might have some have some interesting insights, but broadly speaking, it's not going to deliver something that says, well, your leadership's not going very well, is it, as the transport secretary, unless it's been one that's been deliberately created by the minister in order to nobble the secretary and have an excuse to remove them. That's not, they're not particularly effective. So I think, there isn't a kind of group which is going to go, this is what you need to have. There is bodies around like the Public Service Commission, and so groups that are supposed to be about understanding the capacity and capability of the public service and focusing on that aspect. It's surprising how often they're getting nobbled politically, because I think they're also the guardians of saying you shouldn't be making as many political appointments, which upsets the politicians, because it's undermining the independence of the public service and it's undermining their competency. So you find that they quite often get their legs cut out from beneath them, which is problematic as well. So it's undermining their independence. I think so. The other thing I would say is if you had a situation where our transport systems were moving in the right direction and all you needed to do was turn the handle and go BAU for transport. So we're building lots of roads. The answer to our transport prayers is just build more roads. I think everything would be fine. Okay, because that is the direction of travel. And when generalists take over, that tends to be, it just tends to default to BAU, with tweaks around, but nothing significant to the system. The system changes. When you need to undertake significant system changes, as I would argue that you need to do in the transport system in terms of moving away from the car-dominated towns and cities that we have to much more multimodal systems, the transition to net zero, need to rethink how we move around our cities and integrate transport and land use. You need to have people who understand those sorts of things and recognize them and can champion them and talk about how we're going to deliver them. That's not going to come from generalists, in my view. That's going to come from the people who understand it. And so if you want change in the transport system, you need people who understand this. So I think what you see is when you've got political leaders who want to make significant reforms to their transport system, as you've seen in somewhere like Paris with Anne Hidalgo, which has made significant changes, they need to appoint somebody who understands transport and has a very different view from the status quo.
Now, is that somebody who understands transport or somebody who's actually passionate about transport? Which do you think is more important? I've got my opinion, but I'd love to hear yours first.
Whoa, I would say there's kind of like most of the people I know in transport who are highly knowledgeable are also passionate, right? I think that the idea that it's an either or, I think is not true. I think there's lots of people who are very passionate about transport. I think one of the challenges you have in transport is they might be passionate about a particular mode. And so trying to find someone who's passionate about multimodal travel and understands the broader aspects of the transport system rather than just, I love trains or I love buses or I love active transport. All are great, but, it needs to be somebody who is able to do it. Which brings me onto a broader point, which is across a leadership team, if we're developing leaders, one of the things I think we've made a mistake about is that we haven't moved leaders across disciplines, across transport. In order to develop their leadership capabilities for the future. So if they started off in rail operations, they may well have ended up as the head of the railway department.
Yeah.
Right? But all they know is rail operations. Right? Yes. They haven't done project management. They haven't done strategic planning. They haven't done asset management in a big way. And so often they've got significant gaps and unable to take a holistic view. And one of the things I think we need to do is we need to develop our leaders in transport with more than just a narrow understanding. Even if it's, 6 months secondment to the strategic planning team, spend 6 months working on strategy, spend 6 months working, in the projects, in a project team. So you understand how they operate and work so that when you're going up for senior leadership positions, you have a much more rounded perspective of transport rather than a narrow, I understand projects or I understand operations or I understand strategy, policy.
Yeah. And so I think that's really interesting. So the leaders who do perform the best, from my perspective, are those ones who they may not have spent 6 months in there doing that work, but they're having coffee with with their peers as they go up. They're having coffee with the project manager who's going, this project's going off the rails because of X, Y, and Z. And they may not know how to solve the problem, but they know how to ask the question. And my perspective is, I think the passion's actually more important than the all-round knowledge, because someone who is passionate will become expert, may not be professional expert, but they will learn enough about the topic to be able to understand it, and then to be able to explain to their political masters why a decision's being made.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with you. I'd add a kind of consequence of that passion is that intellectual curiosity about areas that are outside of your current area of expertise. And so willing to listen and understand different perspectives. But I also wonder if you're a senior, top of the transport tree,
Mm.
I think you've got to have a model of how the system works in your head, don't you? You kind of need to understand it at a strategic level about how different things influence the system and what the system is doing in order to be able to affect the system, especially when we're talking about a system that needs significant change as our current systems do.
So it really depends on the change you're trying to affect. So if you're trying to change behavior and what people think about, then that's very much leadership. We're going to stop focusing on cars, and here's why I think it's really important to stop focusing on cars and taking people on the journey. If that's what you want to do, if you want to start, focusing on, more dense walkable environments rather than, building or widening roads, then, the
Yeah. So
culture eats strategy for breakfast. So if the person at the top is passionate about making change, and their selections for the people two rungs down, not their immediate direct reports, are people who want to follow along that vision, then that's where you get that drive for change, because that sends the message to the technical experts. This is what's important to the organization. So the organization can, number of organizational strategy, strategic plans that I've seen in my time, that you've seen in your time, that say, we will achieve a mode share of X% of usage by public transport, walking and cycling, but here's all our money going to widening roads. So all the people that are employed are people who are good at widening roads. So
yes,
you get a culture of widening roads.
yes, and there's a big difference between strategy as written as opposed to strategy as practice, right? And
Yes.
that's that culture aspect of it, right? Is that the strategy is irrelevant for people who are not aligned with the strategy, and
Yeah.
they will basically ignore it, and the sum result is your strategy is not being implemented. Our strategy as written is not implemented in the way.
Yeah. So if you don't have that passion driving the change, because if you have the passion driving the change, then the person who is the passionate one will start weeding out the voices that are business as usual.
Yes, and I definitely think there's a core part of that. I agree, but I think that leader, I would say that they kind of end up in three buckets, right? And this is, do they believe in a kind of transport system for people and goods, or do they believe in it for cars and maybe goods in the sideline, right? Or are they in that? And this is kind of I'd argue probably the biggest bucket, which is, are they in the fudging group? Okay, which is they'll do a bit of everything. Okay, and they'll take solace in the fact that they are doing, whichever bits of that they agree with, and they're doing other bits that they don't necessarily agree with, but they're overall okay, right? Because the problem you end up with that is, I think you end up with the worst of all worlds, right? So you end up with inadequate public transport and active transport, and you just continue to build more roads, more lanes. It's just that you do more public transport than you would do if you would just focus on cars, okay? And you do slightly less road building than you would do if you were focused on cars. But the general direction is still the same, in effect. Your mode shift on public and active transport is still negligible. if anything, you're just basically treading water in most cases. So you don't see significant mode shifts in favor of sustainable transport in most cities. So, it's really about, and they'll say, oh, look, because we're investing in public transport. Yeah, but you're also continuing to build roads. You're still continuing to provide free parking. You're still continuing to build car parks, etc. And I think the problem that what you end up with is if you really want to make change, you have to stop doing that sort of fudge. That's not to say that you'd never build a road again, but you need to change significantly how you're allocating your money and moving it towards those alternative non-car modes.
Yeah, and that's where the signals all the way down from the political class setting budgets. So as we the agencies will propose budgets which then get reviewed by some form of treasury or finance department, and then go through a political washing machine. And even if you have an agency head who is very oriented towards active and public transport and potentially freight as well, they may put up a budget which is then overruled by the politicians. And again, that sets the the strategy and culture of, well, no, actually we at a political level, cars are too important. And if you don't have somebody who's able to advocate in a different direction effectively,
well, this goes
to
back
their political masters.
Yeah, so this goes back to that first port of call of, new minister comes in, what are you saying to the new minister?
Mm.
Right? And if you're basically saying to the minister, everything is fine, minister, we can just carry on as we are, all right? Then if that's your message, which I think would be the message for many generalists, if things are fine, the congestion's a bit bad, but we'll invest a bit more in running roads, we'll invest a bit more in public transport, okay? And things will, get a little bit better maybe. Okay, if that's where you are, then that's what your budget will represent because you've already managed those expectations around the politician. That's what they're expecting. The thing I would say is also there's an agenda for the government, right? So if you've got a new transport minister coming in for a new government, they will have already got a manifesto about what they want to do. Sometimes it will be a radical move towards public and active transport. More often than not, it's really just a continuation of BAU. And all they've done is select projects that are popular in particular marginal seats. And typically, road widenings, roundabout upgrades, those sorts of things. And that will be their agenda. They won't necessarily have a strategic transport agenda. They're often not against public transport. Some of them are, but that's a minority sport, even on, I think for most politicians of either, colour. But, but then it's kind of like, one of the things you've got to provide is that advice to them about saying, by the way, our current policy trajectory means that congestion is going to get significantly worse in our city over the next decade, right? Because I think most ministers would not understand that. They'd be like, really? But we've got these roads we're building. Ah, yes. Let me talk to you about induced demand, Minister.
So, and if you want to learn more about induced demand, I think we've got 2 podcasts where we talk about that. And we also have a podcast where we talk about how to brief an incoming politician. So, okay. So how do we develop transport leaders?
Yeah.
What's your research telling you?
Don't know about my research is telling me, but I haven't seen much in this kind of like...
Okay. What's your experience telling you?
So I think it's very helpful if they have moved around departments, right? And done different things and got different hats, worn different hats. I think that's very helpful. It's not essential.
Within the agency.
Or yes, so they've done different things. It might not be within that same agency because quite a few public servants have moved to different agencies, etc. But if they've got project experience, they've got operations experience, they've got strategy experience and policy experience. I've seen leaders who've got fantastic credentials in project and engineering, okay, but absolutely no idea about strategy and policy. Completely clueless on it. And that's not helpful, right? Because they're coming from an engineering background. So one of the things that I think both you and I would say about China is it's a bit too engineering focused, right? In terms of its transport solutions, right? Its answer to everything is kind of, we'll build something, which is why it's got lots of high-speed rail everywhere. And although high-speed rail is great, in many cases in China, I think they've built too much of it when it's the wrong piece because it's kind of their default lever for engineering. But I think we've got, you need to have a range of skills. Now, some people have got a broad understanding without, as you say, without necessarily having been there. okay? And will have a better understanding of it, perhaps because they're intellectually curious and they've got friends and colleagues who they've been having with coffees with for 2 decades by the time they get to the leadership position and understand the challenges in projects and operations and etc. and have a broad
Yeah.
understanding. But I think that there is, then there comes a question of, well, how do you explain that to the people that are selecting that you have a broad knowledge of transport? Well, I've had coffees for 20 years with people who are in project team, isn't quite as convincing as, I've been on projects, right? I've experienced projects with these types of problems. I understand the challenges in the project space, even though my expertise is in operations.
Yeah, and getting beyond, I suppose it really comes down to what the recruitment consultant's brief is, doesn't it? So, like, in terms of, winnowing out CVs and things like that, because somebody has to do that. I mean, you do occasionally get ministers going, I really want this person for the job.
Alas, yes.
Yeah. And suddenly a CV that wasn't actually part of the initial search appears. But aside from that, how does someone, demonstrate those things when they're going through the processes and, potentially having a coffee with a minister to, so the minister can decide whether they can work with the person or.
Yes. I mean, the challenge here is if it's a very political appointment, which a lot of these ones are, in Australia,
Mm,
increasingly so, right? The ministers haven't got a clue what they should be looking for to appoint, right? They're basically, their priority then is someone who's like, I can work with politically. Okay. Now, don't get me wrong, that's an important aspect of it. I've seen a situation where you've got a secretary that can't work with a minister, and that's a train wreck, right? That's a disaster. You don't want to be in that situation. But there's a much broader consideration. And so the person who is, maybe the second best person in terms of political fit, but is a good fit still, okay, but is far more capable technically from a transport perspective and has a broader understanding of transport, is far better selection than the first person. But politicians might go with the first person because it's the politically convenient one for them, even if that
yeah.
person is not the best person to run transport.
And transport, I think, is probably one of the more interesting ones from a media and communications sense. I mean, how often do you see the Secretary of the Department of Finance fronting up to the media over an issue, or um, the probably transport, health, education would be the ones where the the when things go wrong, people expect to see the secretary or very senior bureaucrat standing beside the minister.
Okay. So let me
Yeah,
blow my
yeah,
own trumpet here a little
yeah,
bit in terms of
yeah.
like thing. So when I was in government, and we appointed a secretary, okay, one is we picked a good secretary, so not a lot went wrong. So the amount of times that you needed to go in front of the media was greatly reduced. The second thing was we had a senior leader within transport who was the person, and it wasn't the secretary, who would go in front of the media on things. So it wasn't that and the secretary, I don't think the secretary ever went on. I can't remember any time that the secretary went on something. I mean, we didn't have a disaster. If it had been a major disaster, sort of another rail disaster or something like that, maybe then you kind of like, it has to be the secretary. But we never, all the challenges that we had, that we were going through, it was never the secretary that was the one being put forward. It was either the minister or a senior spokesman from the department.
Who was very, if I think I know who you're talking about, very operationally focused and across the detail of operations.
Well, no, actually, so we had
No?
several. I mean, that's a good point. We
Yeah,
actually had several
yeah,
people, right? So we
yeah,
did have someone who was who was in that space with very much detail and operations on rail in particular. But we also had other people who were very good in sort of more sort of like broader customer understanding and other aspects of the transport system. So we had several people who you could put up as and when you needed to. And I'll be honest with you, what did I want my transport secretary spending time on? Did I want them spending time on being in front of the media, or did I want them on spending their time running a good transport department? And 99.99999% of the time, I want them spending time on running a good department, right? And in fairness to the secretary, he did run a good department at the time, right? And I think it was generally considered to be a period of success on at many levels. And part of that is he didn't need to be in front of the media. That wasn't the criteria. And I would question, if your secretary has to be in front of the media all the time, something's going wrong with your department, and it's probably as a result of them spending too much time on the media and not fixing the department. So, that's, I think there's probably a strong correlation between the problems in the department and the amount of times the secretary goes in front of has to go in front of the cameras.
Yeah.
And part of that's the minister as well. Is the minister got people that he trusts to go in front of the media from the department? Right? If the only person they trust to go in front of the department, in front of the media from the department is the secretary, that's a problem as well.
Yeah. So it's really about having good, diverse leadership teams.
Well, I'm a massive believer in building really good leadership teams, right? I think the idea that you can do it through, we're talking about, in say New South Wales's case, they're spending a couple of $1 billion every month, right, on projects. The idea that that sort of size of organization, can't remember how many people it is now, 30,000, something in that region. You can deliver by just one person at the top of the organization, covering rail, buses, light rail, trams, ferries, walking, cycling, cars, all the rest of it. You need a team. And you need a good team of people. And one of the things I would say is we're not good at. So these days, for coaching boards, one of the things they say is essential for good boards is assessing your skills capabilities and your skills matrix. What are the gaps that you have that you need to fill in the board? Do you have, for example, good finance skills on the board? Do you have people who understand, operations on your board? Do you have people who are subject matter experts in the particular type of organization that you are? Right? We are really poor, I think, at doing that at the heads of departments for transport. Because similarly, you'd want to be going, well, ideally, I'd have people with expertise in my leadership team that have got expertise in operations, in strategy, in projects, in asset management, in finance for transport, a whole bunch of other skill sets that you should have in the transport space, and going, where do I have my gaps and how am I going to fill them?
So I suppose this brings me to another question. Is the American style where you have a board that is external to the operations setting strategy and then the agencies delivering strategy, is that something that could potentially improve the leadership?
Well, we just have to look at the outcomes that it's delivering for the American system. Do I think
I
the
think
transport system...
it depends on where you are, I suppose.
Right? It depends on where you
Yeah.
are, but even the best examples are not fantastic, right? So
Yeah.
even places like, the highest transit use is, New York. I think second is probably Chicago, right? Even their transit systems are not fantastic by world standards,
Yeah.
right? So the American model is not one I would seek to look
Okay.
for great outcomes and therefore to be copied. As I said, we talked about London earlier. London does a really good job of having both sort of a political expertise that has a kind of transport bent, as well as having people who understand the transport system in real detail and has really high quality people doing that as in charge of the day to day and the strategy of the transports, working with the political leaders. That for me seems to be a model that works very well and provides you with both that political and technical knowledge as well.
Yeah. So in Australia, probably the closest example that we have are the councils in Queensland. We have, aside from public transport now, but historically had devolved transport management. So you would have a councillor in charge of transport. So Brisbane City Council, Gold Coast City Council, forgive me, other people in Queensland, not really sure. They have a chair of a transport committee who is effectively a deputy mayor in charge of transport.
They are. I think the advantage of the London system is you can appoint anyone. It doesn't have to be someone who's elected.
Mm.
So that deputy mayor in London is not an elected role. It is a directly appointed political role. And that means that you can pick from a lot more, a deep talent pool of people that can both bridge the political and the transport aspects for that role. If it's a council, your talent pool is very limited to the councillors.
Yes.
And so the chances of you getting somebody who's really good is much smaller. So would I say that's a good model? Personally, I think that's not a good model.
Yes. Thanks, Russell. And hopefully people are liking the new format with more than one talking head at a time. And if you want to help us fund having a slightly better looking podcast or actually getting somebody professional to help us out, please feel free to drop us a donation on YouTube, Patreon, buy us a train or bus ticket, whatever you want to call it. And we will be in your feed again next week.